high-level segment. I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, Minister of External Affairs of India, via video message.
Mr. President, let me begin by congratulating you on your election as President of the Council. I assure you of India's full support and cooperation during the 61st session of the Human Rights Council. India began this high-level segment as an elected member of the Human Rights Council. Our mandate reflects the trust and expectations of the international community, especially of partners in the Global South. As the world's largest democracy, India remains firmly committed to working with all members and observers to promote and protect all human rights for all people on the basis of equality, openness, and respect. Mr. President, for us, human rights are not abstract ideals, but an integral part of our civilizational ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam that sees the world as one family. We firmly believe that the deliberations in this Council must translate into tangible improvements in the daily lives of the most vulnerable, transcending statements and resolutions. In recent years, the devastating impact of the pandemic, climate change, geopolitical tensions, and economic stress have exacerbated existing inequities. For many communities, these translate into lost years of schooling, pressures on food and fuel security, and mounting debt burdens. All these erode the promise of human rights and backsliding on the achievement of sustainable development goals. We speak from our experience as a developing country that has known poverty and external shocks and yet has chosen the path of democracy, pluralism, and social justice. India has been investing in developing human capacities at an unprecedented scale. Our digital public infrastructure, DPI, including digital identity, interoperable payments, and inclusive service delivery platforms, have enabled hundreds of millions to access welfare benefits, financial services, and public schemes with transparency and minimal leakage. Our DPI experience has also been shared as a global public good with our partners, reaffirming that technology can and must be a force multiplier for human rights, not a new fault line. Mr. President, in a world marred by conflict, polarization, and uncertainty, India seeks to find and expand common ground. We have consistently underlined dialogue over confrontation, consensus over division, and human-centric development over narrow interests. Our vision is rooted in the understanding that the insecurity of any region or the marginalization of any group eventually undermines the rights and well-being of all. India approaches this Council with the conviction that human rights are best advanced through dialogue, capacity building, and genuine partnerships, and not by politicization, selectivity, or double standards. Over the years, India's humanitarian outreach has been guided by empathy rather than just geography. Whether through disaster relief, medical supplies, vaccines, food grains, or development partnerships, India has been a dependable partner of first resort for many. We remain firm and uncompromising, Mr. President, in our opposition to terrorism in all forms and manifestations as well. Terrorism is among the most egregious violations of human rights, and there can be no justification, especially when innocent lives are targeted. Confronting terrorism requires collective resolve, and we look at this Council and to the United Nations at large to advocate zero tolerance for terrorist acts. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating India's commitment drawing on its own democratic experience to contribute towards the promotion and protection of human rights for all. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Madalitso Chidumu Baloyi, Minister of Health and Sanitation of Malawi. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to address this council on behalf of the government and the people of the Republic of Malawi. At a moment of both reflection and resolve, as Malawi approaches the conclusion of its current membership of this council in December 2026. Over the past 5 years, Malawi has sought to be principled, constructive, and reliable member of the Human Rights Council. Guided by dialogue, cooperation, and respect of international law, we have consistently supported the Council's mandate to promote and protect all human rights for all. Malawi has engaged actively in resolutions, interactive dialogues, and universal periodic review, convinced that strong multilateral institutions remain indispensable in addressing today's complex and interconnected challenges. Mr. President, Malawi's engagement in this council is grounded in a deep belief in multilateralism. For countries such as ours, multilateralism is not an abstract ideal, it is a necessity. It is through collective action, shared responsibility, and mutual accountability that we can advance peace, development, and human dignity. Malawi, therefore, reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the multilateral system with the United Nations at its center. Central to Malawi's approach to human rights is the indivisibility and interdependence of all rights, with particular emphasis on economic, social, and cultural rights. We firmly believe that civil and political rights cannot be fully realized in the absence of social justice, inclusive development, and equitable access to basic services. In this regard, Malawi continues to champion the right to development as a universal and inalienable human rights development. It must be people-centered, inclusive, and sustainable. It must leave no one behind, including those in rural communities, women and girls, persons with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. Closely linked to this is the right to the highest attainable standard of health, which Malawi views as both a human rights obligation and a developing imperative. Malawi is not merely the absence of disease. It is a fundamental to human dignity, productivity, and social cohesion. Strengthening health systems, expanding access to essential services, and addressing preventable, treatable diseases are therefore human rights priorities. Mr. President, Malawi's national vision, the Malawi 2063, places human capital development at the heart of our long-term transformation agenda. Health, education, and social protection are recognized as key enablers of economic growth and resilience. This national vision is fully aligned with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Africa's Agenda 2063. both of which affirm that sustainable development and human rights are mutually reinforcing. As we strive to translate these commitments into action, we are acutely aware that global inequalities continue to undermine the enjoyment of human rights, particularly in the global south. Climate change, pandemics, debt distress, and emerging health threats disproportionately affect developing countries and demand coordinated international responses grounded in solidarity and equity. In this context, I wish to announce that Malawi is working with several countries to table a resolution on human rights and neglected tropical diseases at 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. Neglected tropical diseases continue to affect more than 1 billion people worldwide, trapping communities in cycles of poverty, ill health, and exclusion. They are both a cause and a consequence of inequality. Through this resolution, Malawi seeks to elevate neglected tropical diseases as a human rights concern, highlighting their impact on the right to health, the right to development, and the dignity of those affected communities. We aim to promote prevention, to promote treatment, international cooperation, and sustainable financing while reinforcing national ownership and community-based approaches. We look forward to engaging constructively with member states, civil societies, and other stakeholders in advancing this important initiative. I thank you all.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dhananjay Ramphul, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration and International Trade of Mauritius via video message.
The United Nations Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the President of the Human Rights Council, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to congratulate you, Mr. President, on your election to the Council's presidency. I assure you of the full support of my delegation during your mandate. 2 decades ago, we created this assembly to uphold human dignity, to avoid the politicization of human rights, and to strengthen human rights mechanisms. But let us ask ourselves, have we been successful in providing our people with a life of dignity? This question is even more relevant today, at a time when the rules-based international order is at a crossroads. The global human rights architecture is fractured. Across the world, in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, war has reared its hideous head. Terrorism continues to tear our societies apart. Unilateral sanctions continue to affect the common people and deepen inequalities. We are witnessing indiscriminate attacks on hospitals, schools, causing civilian casualties and violation of the Geneva Conventions at unprecedented levels. The conflicts on the African continent in Sudan, Mali, Libya, the Democratic Republic of Congo are affecting the civilian population, denying our children of their basic rights to life and education. The Council cannot be a passive actor by adopting resolutions. Now is the time for action-oriented resolutions that ensure economic and social rights are met on the available resources. Mr. President, many of our citizens migrate to other places in search of better economic and social opportunities, often falling victims of sexual and gender-based violence, forced labor, and trafficking. These issues must be prioritized. This year, we also commemorate on the 25th years of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The fear of the other continues to fracture our societies. We are witnessing a resurgence of cases of xenophobia and discrimination, including in the most established democracies. Mr. President, it was in this very council that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was first recognized. We since cannot overemphasize the nexus between climate change and human rights. Last year, the International Court of Justice recognized that climate change had adverse effects on our health, livelihoods of individuals through the events such as the sea level rise, drought, desertification, and natural disasters. For since this is a matter of upholding our basic rights, our right to life, our right to food, our right to health. This is why the rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and nature would be enshrined in our Constitution in the near future. Mr. President, new and emerging technologies have reshaped our societies. They empower our youth. Social media have possibly become a new pillar of digital governance. However, without guardrails, they discriminate and violate our right to privacy. Mr. President, 20 years later, the Council has had an opportunity to make it right for those who are yet to come, to uphold the promises on which it was founded. But it also depends on all of us, on the kind of society we engender and the kind of future we build. This 1st of January, Mauritius began its 3-year term as a member of the Human Rights Council. We pledge to adhere to the founding principles of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights and to work to ensure that this council remains fit for purpose. I thank you.
I thank you, Excellency. I have now the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Baiba Braze, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, via video message.
Mr. President, Excellencies, we mark the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Council. Amidst geopolitical uncertainty and attacks on the rules-based international order. We also mark 4 years since Russia launched its brutal war against Ukraine, a war entirely illegal and unprovoked, a war rooted in imperial colonial aspirations. And Russia continues its barbaric aggression, deliberately destroying energy infrastructure and trying to freeze millions of Ukrainians to death. These are war crimes and crimes against humanity. Russia has trapped under occupation or forcibly deported to Russia over 1.6 million Ukrainian children. These kids are subjected to illegal adoptions, indoctrination and militarization, and it's all aimed at erasing their Ukrainian identity. Russia must immediately ensure their safe and unconditional return to Ukraine. Russia and its leadership must be held accountable for all atrocities committed. And Latvia fully supports completing the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The special tribunal and comprehensive compensation mechanism are vital to holding Russia accountable and bringing justice to Ukraine. Russia is the sole obstacle to achieving just and lasting peace in Ukraine. The international community must move beyond statements. We urge all countries to exert maximum pressure on Russia and restrict Russia's economy, including through sanctions, including other restrictive measures to stop its ability to wage war. We call for further diplomatic and political isolation of Russia and Belarus in international organizations, including within the UN system. We urge all countries to increase support for Ukraine's self-defense and survival. It is our common interest that the rules-based international order and international law is upheld. Mr. President, in Russia, Putin's regime is war. War economy, war propaganda, war religion, mass repressions, censorship. Even in education system, it has become part of the war machine. The human rights situation has eroded dramatically, including a vicious assault on civic freedoms within Russia. There are more than 1,900 political prisoners in Russia today. Numerous deserters have been subjected to compulsory psychiatric treatment, bringing back the darkest of Soviet methods. Many have been jailed for opposing the war of aggression against Ukraine. Over 280 civil organizations have been labeled as undesirable. Latvia strongly condemns the Russian government's expansion of repressive tools and the use of national security legislation to silence dissent. Mr. President, in Belarus, gross, systematic and widespread human rights violations continue to take place. Latvia notes recent releases of political prisoners and thanks the United States for making it possible. Yet more than 1,100 remain imprisoned on political grounds. We continue to urge the Belarusian regime to release all political prisoners. Latvia will continue to support the democratic rights of the people of Belarus in their quest for a free, sovereign and independent Belarus. Mr. President, Iran has once again launched war against its own people. The Iranian people, exhausted by repressions and economic deprivation, demand basic rights and human dignity. These demands are met with brutality, violence and censorship by the regime. Thousands have been killed, arrested, tortured. Latvia condemns in the strongest possible terms the brutal actions of the Iranian regime. We support the brave Iranian people standing up for their freedom. Latvia, a member of the EU, supported the imposition of sanctions on those, including IRGC commanders responsible for serious human rights violations. We also welcome the release of political prisoners in Venezuela. We call on the authorities to unconditionally release all remaining political prisoners. We welcome the Council's attention to these and other extremely concerning human rights situations, including in Sudan, the DRC, and Afghanistan. And as an elected member of the UN Security Council, Latvia strongly commits to upholding international law, strengthening peace, security, and multilateral system. My country will continue to support women's empowerment, gender equality, prevention and elimination of sexual violence and armed conflict. At this critical time, Latvia stands by its commitment to promote and respect human rights globally. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Augustin Eman, Minister of Justice, Keeper of the Seals, and in charge of human rights of Gabon. Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. It's a huge honor for me to speak today on behalf of the Gabon Republic before this august body, pillar of our multilateral architecture. In this respect, I would like to avail myself of this solemn opportunity to convey to you the warm greetings of His Excellency Mr. Driss Clotaire Bolingengema, President of the Republic and Head of State. May I also commend His Excellency Sidarto Reza Siodipuro for his election to preside over the Human Rights Council for 2026 and convey to him my encouragement to Mr. Volker Türk, High Commissioner, for his tireless efforts towards human dignity despite the liquidity crisis currently gripping the system. Mr. President, we've undergone a transition period of 2 years, which began on the 31st of August 2023, and Gabon, subsequent to that, is not only a state which is being built, but also a nation which is actively laying the foundation for a democracy rooted in solid foundations such as universal suffrage, the rule of law, the separation of powers. I say this because this political process, which has been successful, has laid fundamental landmarks down, which is why I'm proud to announce to this Council that my country has once and for all turned the page of transition and is now entered into its fifth republic. The new constitution, which had been adopted by majority in referendum, enshrines fundamental rights and the separation of powers. The return to the constitutional order became a reality through free and peaceful elections sanctioned, supported by international and national monitoring bodies. Beyond these institutional reforms, Gabon has been tirelessly restating its commitment to international human rights instruments, its party to, and in particular through strong, determined actions and measures. In the area of social and economic rights, the government of Gabon has launched an ambitious program to redistribute national wealth through the creation of a new subsidies regime or social security scheme for the vulnerable, and through the creation of a bank designed to finance youth entrepreneurship. Gabon is determined to actively contribute to the efforts made by the international community to promote and protect the rights of women and girls. My country is vigorously promoting gender parity, the protection of women against all forms of violence, as well as their empowerment through financing of activities that generate income-generating activities. The reform of the justice system is underway, and in order to make it a reality, we have strengthened human rights capacities. We've given training to defence and security forces. We've also improved conditions in prisons. Mr. President, Gabon, through me today, is committing itself to strengthen its cooperation with the UN mechanisms and bodies, human rights mechanisms and bodies, which is why it's in that spirit that we'll be involved in the various dialogues we have planned, scheduled with the Committee Against Torture, with the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, and also with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We shall very shortly convey our reports, or send our reports, to the Human Rights Committee, that is for the ICCPR. The midterm review or report for the UPR, as well as our voluntary 2026 report on the Global Compact on safe, orderly and regular migration. May I recall at this stage that in a world facing hybrid threats such as misinformation and disinformation, it is crucial that we create an international regulatory framework to govern the use of artificial intelligence. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in the current intellectual context involving an unprecedented crisis of multilateralism, my country remains convinced that respect for the fundamental rights enshrined in principle, enshrined in the Charter, and international solidarity are things that we have achieved and things that we need to protect. We support in this context the UN80 initiatives in favour of the streamlining and the increasing of the efficiency of the UN system. But this streamlining, this increasing effectiveness must not happen to the detriment of the operation of the human rights bodies, of the implementation of their mandates, and to the detriment of multilingualism. We therefore call upon New York and Geneva to engage in more productive, more intense dialogue. May I also finally reveal myself of this opportunity to thank all of our bilateral, regional and multilateral partners for the support they have provided to us to help us to strengthen the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Winston Peters, Minister of Foreign Affairs of New Zealand, via video message.
Thank you, Mr. President. Respect for human rights is critical for our collective stability, security and prosperity, and societies in which citizens can enjoy their universal human rights have a better chance of avoiding the descent into conflict that tragically impacts so many across the world today. That is why the work of this Council is important, and why human rights is one of the three core pillars of the United Nations. All three pillars, peace and security, development and human rights, are mutually reinforcing. New Zealand supports the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This includes in the Pacific, where its technical assistance and partnerships continue to strengthen the realisation of human rights and sustainable development across the region. This council is also important for accountability when violations do occur. New Zealand strongly supports the mandate of this council to look at specific serious situations of global concern, as it did recently in respect of human rights abuses in Iran. The investigative mechanisms that it establishes, such as those for Myanmar and Sudan, are important for accountability and ultimately for lifting respect for human rights universally. This council is not operating in isolation and also needs to do its part in the wider UN 80 reform initiatives underway. Given the scale of its current structural, fiscal and geopolitical challenges, the United Nations and its member states have no choice but to change the way we do things. New Zealand wants to see bold and effective reforms that enhance the United Nations' credibility and legitimacy. We want to see a UN system more focused on delivering real impact and value for the people it serves. We must remember that a lot is within our control as member states. We collectively generate the work of the UN, and we each have a responsibility to respect its charter. We want to use this opportunity to work with others to secure positive changes to the way we do things. That is why New Zealand is engaging actively in the UN 80 reform process, and why, together with Jamaica, we are co-chairing the Mandate Implementation Review process under Work Stream 2. This will design a new approach for how we all, as member states, task the UN through resolutions and decisions, including of this Council, which in turn impacts where and how the UN spends its time and resources. For New Zealand, reform is not just about budget cuts. It is about having a UN that is effective and focused. We want to see rationalisation because the sheer volume of initiatives, meetings, reports and resolutions is undermining their overall effectiveness. The success of the Secretary General's process will depend on all of us as member states changing the way we do things. We strongly believe we need to reform the way we do things in order to make our collective work more effective. We encourage all members to continue participating in the reform process with an open and positive mindset so we can collectively ensure we have a United Nations that is fit for purpose and delivers for the decades ahead. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mihai Popsoi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Moldova. You have the floor, Excellency.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is an honor to address you here today at the Human Rights Council. I believe it's a common feeling in the room that we have gathered here at a pivotal moment in the international rules-based system. In Davos, it was called the rupture. In Munich, it was the destruction. Regardless how we call it, the emerging consensus is clear. The global order we relied upon for decades is gone. But it is important that our founding principles of peace, sovereignty, territorial integrity, respect for human rights, international solidarity remain unchanged. So the key question is how to transition to a new system without compromising on fundamentals and preserving everything we worked for. How to make sure that the respect for human rights and freedoms remains the core of any future arrangements. It will take time to find the answer in global terms, but in today's world, we need to move fast, and every single state can be part of the answer. This is how my country, the Republic of Moldova, is bringing its contribution. By showing solidarity, by delivering on its commitments, and by playing a key role on the international level. First, on solidarity. We are commemorating the 4th year since the Russians launched the brutal, unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. 4 years of destruction, immense suffering, senseless loss of life. We strongly believe in accountability, and therefore we work together with UN, Council of Europe and civil society to gather the evidence of war crimes and human rights violations. It is crucial. My country remains a steadfast supporter of all international initiatives aimed at securing comprehensive accountability for war in Ukraine. This includes our active participation in the Register of Damages, operationalization of the Special Tribunal for the Crimes of Aggression against Ukraine, and the establishment of International Claims Commission. Moldova has been and remains in full solidarity with Ukraine and its people. Moldova recently welcomed, throughout the past 4 years, the largest number of refugees per capita. We recently extended the temporary protection mechanism for Ukrainian refugees and delivered an additional batch of humanitarian assistance. We hope that the ongoing intensive diplomatic efforts will finally lead towards achieving a just and comprehensive peace in Ukraine. Now let me turn to commitments. The Republic of Moldova will continue strengthening its democratic institutions and upholding the rule of law, which are two ultimate guarantors of respect for human rights for a stable and resilient society. This is not only our national policy, but also a major milestone on our path towards the European Union. We are committed to continue improving our record in various areas such as education, gender equality, countering gender-based violence, inclusion of persons with disabilities, improving conditions of detention. We will also be defending democracy, combating through legal means any form of hybrid interference and influence. The two recent rounds of elections in Moldova have shown that this is a real threat which should not be underestimated. A particular attention will continue to be paid to the human rights situation in the Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova, where our citizens are still mostly deprived of adequate protection of their rights. Work of National Human Rights Mechanism, but also execution of the judgments delivered by the European Court of Human Rights are essential. Now, about the role at the international level. As the country holds the presidency of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, the Republic of Moldova is being guided by three major axes. First, support for Ukraine and the accountability for the crimes of aggression. Second, support for the new Democratic Pact for Europe initiative, a timely approach to reinforce our shared democratic values and institutional resilience. Third, strengthen our response to disinformation, which remains one of the main tools for external hybrid influence against democracies. In May, foreign ministers of the Council of Europe countries will gather in Chisinau to discuss the results achieved under these priorities and pave the way for future actions. Furthermore, the Republic of Moldova is looking forward to being elected member of the Human Rights Council later this year, mandate starting in 2027. If elected, we are committed to strengthening the rule of law and Human Rights Council as the venue for dialogue, as provider of solutions, and as a collective and unique tool for strengthening respect for human rights. We firmly believe that the establishment of the Human Rights Council was essential to making a real and lasting difference in people's lives. Finally, Mr. President, while rebuilding our global and rule-based order, we need to have solid and effective institutions at its core. Therefore, we need a well-capacitated office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and a well-functioning Human Rights Council. This is essential for reaching adequate grave situations like the recently witnessed in Iran or ongoing conflict in Sudan. This is equally important for helping peace process such as in Gaza and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We are confident that continuity, consistency and effectiveness of the international human rights instruments will define a systematic and sustainable preventive measure that will contribute at eradicating the roots of human rights crisis. Hence, we strongly call for a meaningful outcome of UN 80 process, which will make the human rights pillar of the UN stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sid Ahmed Eli Benan, Commissioner for Human Rights, Humanitarian Action, and Relations with Civil Society of Mauritania. You have the floor, Excellency.
Monsieur le Président,
President, In the name of God, most compassionate. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address you today on behalf of the government of the Islamic Republic of Mauritania in order to renew our constant commitment to human rights values and principles of justice, dignity, and equality, as well as the principle of dialogue as a strategic choice that cannot be replaced with anything else amid a world that is facing deep transformation and polarization. That's why we would like to reiterate the importance of this council, a forum of sincere dialogue and responsible cooperation. In the field of human rights, we are deeply convinced that human rights cannot be a tool of political pressure, nor a way of imposing selectivity according to some particular interest. It is a group of a multiplicity of values based on mutual respect, non-interference in internal affairs of countries outside of the framework that has been internationally agreed. In this context, we would like to reiterate that the credibility of the human rights system requires a cohesion in standards and equality in positions. Democratic countries that have a long record of strengthening their human rights institution for their own citizens, these countries should endorse the same pattern of behavior towards the developing countries. The peoples of the developing countries should also remain attached to their legitimate rights for an equal and mutual relation. Human rights are a joint responsibility, but also an ethical commitment whereby countries should be equal in dignity, in respect, in rights and obligations. Mr. Chair, our countries, namely in the Sahel area, are facing challenges that are not theoretical nor just titles in the headlines. We are witnessing on a daily basis the consequences of terrorism, organized crime, irregular displacement and migration, as well as economic and climate challenges. Despite all of the above, Mauritania has been keen on imposing a fragile equation or a critical equation between preserving security and preserving rights and freedoms, because we are deeply convinced that security and human rights are not two contradictory choices or options, but two parallel choices that cannot be implemented but together. Sustainable security cannot be achieved unless we respect the law, justice, and equality. Based on this principle, my government is pursuing its strenuous efforts at the international and regional levels in order to efficiently contribute into finding solutions to various areas of conflicts in the world, namely in our neighboring countries. We have been receiving and hosting migrants, asylum seekers from neighboring Mali. We have also been implementing a comprehensive security approach to counter terrorism, extremism, and transnational organized crime, in addition to taking part efficiently in peacekeeping forces in Central Africa. Mr. Chair, we cannot address the situation of human rights globally without mentioning the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza, a suffering that has exceeded all expectations. pictures of devastation and destruction by the occupation, as well as tens of thousands of displaced women, children, and older persons, is a clear indication that the international community failed to shoulder its responsibility. That's why we are required today to double our efforts to ensure humanitarian assistance access to Gaza in necessary amounts, as well as supporting the efforts of reconstruction in order to end the suffering of the Palestinian people. Mr. President, human rights in my country is a sovereign choice based on our deep conviction, based on our constitution that safeguards freedom, as well as a vision of reform based on a progressive reform based on self-evaluation, as well as openness on partnership and promoting the role of national institutions. His Excellency, the President, Mr. Mohammed Wald Sheikh Ghazwani, since he came to Tower, has been endorsing an approach based on openness towards all efficient partners without discrimination, distinction, as well as promoting civil peace and civil cohesion. And this was the main guiding principle of the work of our government. We have worked on also promoting national cohesion, national solidarity and unity, and tackling inequalities. In the same context, we are continuing the implementation of our national strategy to protect and promote human rights 2024-2028, which integrates and mainstreams human rights in all public policies, as well as increasing the efficiency of national institutions and promoting the principles of accountability and responsibility. Mr. Chair, we are deeply convinced that promoting human rights cannot be dissociated from sustainable and equitable development. We cannot call for human rights when we don't provide essential services. In this context, we have intensified our efforts to fight poverty, expand social safety nets, as well as improving access to health and education, and enabling most vulnerable groups such as women and the youth. However, the development challenges for developing countries are exacerbated by the burden of the debt and obstacles to accessing development projects. This undoubtedly hampers our efforts to achieve socio-economic development to our citizens. That's why we call upon the international community to alleviate financial burdens on developing countries, so that our countries will be able to pursue the implementation of their developing projects and to protect the most vulnerable groups. Mr. Chair, based on our geographic situation, we are a main transit route for migrants and asylum seekers seeking a better life, and this is accompanied with increasing challenges in terms of humanitarian, legal, and rights perspectives. Many of these migrants are victims of trafficking networks and human trafficking networks, and this is undoubtedly a serious violation of their rights and dignity. Based on our international obligations, we have adopted a balanced approach that works on the one hand on combating trafficking networks and promoting the rights of the migrants. We have promoted the legal framework. We have intensified follow-up efforts in terms of legal and law enforcement agencies. We have also secured access to basic services, and we gave due attention to the most vulnerable groups, namely women, children, as well as respecting the principle of non-refoulement. Managing migration under a human right perspective or umbrella is a shared responsibility. Transit countries cannot be the only countries to carry this burden, we require international community support based on shared responsibilities and tackling the root causes of illegal and irregular migration from the country of origin. In the previous years, we have cooperated positively with human rights mechanisms in the United Nations. In the previous months, we have submitted our national report to the UPR in its fourth cycle, and we will tackle the recommendations within a national plan that will tackle our development priorities and our realities on the ground. In December, we also submitted our second periodic report to the UN Committee on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families. And last October, we have been elected as members of the CAT. In addition to all of the above, we have received many visits by special procedures from the Honorable Council. The latest was the visit of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants in last September, and this is a clear indication that we are open to objective evaluation and frank dialogue. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, let us reiterate our commitment to the approach of reform, promoting our national institutions, because we are deeply convinced that our ultimate objective is the human dignity. Justice is the right path to achieve a sustainable and real progress. Thank you, and may God's peace and blessings be upon you all.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Yohei Onishi, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, distinguished ministers, Excellency, it's my great honor to have this opportunity to deliver a statement on behalf of the government of Japan.
Mr. President, today, many people across the globe, including Ukraine, Myanmar, and Sudan, are facing dire human rights circumstances. The international order, based on fundamental values and principles such as freedom, democracy, basic human rights, and the rule of law, is being profoundly challenged. The international community must unite to send a clear message that we stand behind this order and will act to protect and uphold it. Mr. President, the protection of human rights is the basic responsibility of all nations. It is essential that the international community continue dialogue and cooperation with a view to fulfilling this responsibility. Japan has promoted bilateral human rights dialogues and supported the efforts of other countries. Cambodia is a case in point. Japan has engaged in the Japan-Cambodia Human Rights Dialogue and has submitted a series of resolutions on the human rights situation in the country. In this way, we have continuously facilitated Cambodia's own efforts in this area. All of these resolutions have been adopted by consensus, including the most recent one adopted last October. We hope to see Cambodia further promoting efforts toward improving its human rights situation. Japan has also submitted a series of resolutions on the elimination of discrimination against persons affected by leprosy and their family members. There is a long history of discrimination against persons affected by leprosy, and the fight against such discrimination remains ongoing. We will continue to work with the international community to eliminate such discrimination and prejudice. This year, Japan has contributed approximately 3.6 million USD in total to OHCHR to support projects for the protection of human rights in Syria, Palestine, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Moldova, among others. Protection of women's rights is also crucially important. To promote women's economic empowerment, Japan contributed approximately 13 million USD in 2025 to UN Women to support its work in this area. We also support the activities of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Japan will continue to cooperate closely with international organizations, including OHCHR, to contribute to international efforts to promote and protect human rights. Mr. President, while pursuing dialogue and cooperation, the international community should speak up firmly against serious human rights violations. The issue of abductions by North Korea must be resolved without delay as an urgent humanitarian matter. This issue relates to the sanctity of human life, and no time can be spared in resolving it. Given the aging of the abductees and their families, Japan will continue to strongly urge North Korea to let the abduction victims return to their homes immediately. We will do so in close cooperation with the international community, including through the resolutions on the situation of human rights in DPRK. Freedom, respect for human rights, and the rule of law must also be protected in China, including in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Japan is deeply concerned about the human rights situation in China and reiterates its position of strongly urging China to take constructive and concrete actions. Regarding the protests in Iran since the end of last year, Japan opposes any use of force against peaceful protests and calls for the protection of the fundamental rights of its citizens, including the right to freedom of expression and the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association without fear of reprisal. We have serious concerns about the continuing grave human rights and humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Japan will contribute to improving the situation in Gaza and to rebuilding the Gaza Strip by undertaking efforts for sustaining peace through various forms of assistance. Mr. President, Japan is also taking human rights-related initiatives domestically. Last December, we revised Japan's National Action Plan, NAP, on business and human rights with the aim of promoting respect for human rights more effectively in the context of business activities. Through the implementation and promotion of the revised NAP, Japan will promote responsible business conduct. In this way, we will enhance our efforts toward the promotion and protection of human rights across society as a whole, including within the international community, and toward the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Of the Human Rights Council will continue to uphold the free and open international order based on the rule of law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Beat Mel Resinger, Federal Minister for European and International Affairs of Austria, via video message.
Mr. President, Madam President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. High Commissioner, dear Volker, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow marks another year since Russia launched its full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. Almost 1,500 days have passed since the start of this brutal attack, with thousands of lives lost. On the eve of this anniversary, we are reminded once again that peace, security, and human rights can never be taken for granted. They must be defended every day. It is both an honor and a privilege to address this Council today for the first time. Since its establishment 20 years ago, the Human Rights Council has proven to be a vital pillar of our collective efforts to advance human rights worldwide. It has shown time and again that it is uniquely placed to shine a light on human rights violations and to speak up for those whose voices are silenced. The Council provides an indispensable platform to confront urgent and difficult issues, calling out violations wherever they occur, while also strengthening states' capacity to address human rights challenges through cooperation and dialogue. Through instruments such as the Universal Periodic Review, it holds all states accountable for their human rights records, making clear that no one stands above scrutiny. Austria is no exception. We take this responsibility seriously. We underwent our 4th Universal Periodic Review before this Council in January, and we will carefully examine all recommendations with the aim of accepting and implementing as many of them as possible. Yet, we must be clear-eyed about the realities of our time. The systems and institutions designed to safeguard human rights are under unprecedented pressure. We face a world of disruption, uncertainty, and deepening division. Global security is increasingly fragmented, geopolitical tensions are rising, and too often we see a retreat from long-held values. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a dangerous trend, a return to a world where power outweighs principle. It is precisely in these moments of crisis that we must remember the tools we need to confront these challenges are already in our hands. We do not need to reinvent them. We need to strengthen them. We must double down on multilateralism, a rules-based international order, and above all, the protection and promotion of human rights. This is not idealism. It is enlightened self-interest. Human rights are not abstract ideals. They are a fundamental part of what it means to be human, rooted in our need for freedom, equality, and dignity. They are not privileges granted by governments. They are universal rights, inherent to every person from birth. Without human rights for all, there can be no lasting peace, no long-term security, no sustainable development, and no thriving societies. That is why we must remain steadfast in our commitment to protect human rights for everyone, everywhere, together. Austria has been and will remain a strong supporter of the international human rights system. We stand ready to do our part, because whether governments or civil society, international organizations or the private sector, the rule of law and human rights concern us all. Responsibility is shared and partnership is essential. And while much in our world today feels unstable, one thing is certain. When it comes to human rights, Austria stands firmly behind them. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gordan Grilic Radman, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, via video message.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. This year, the Human Rights Council celebrates 20 years of its work. Yet the global community faces complex, interconnected and ever-growing challenges. Croatia is convinced that the response to these challenges can only come through robust multilateralism. UN 80 initiative stands out as a crucial tool. Its reforms should bolster accountability and renew faith in collective action for peace, development and human rights. Mr. President, serious human rights violations were registered in many regions of the world last year. Ukraine heroically endures yet another year of Russian aggression and grave breaches of international humanitarian law. The international community needs to remain committed to support Ukraine, and Croatia will continue to do so, including in the humanitarian field. In Sudan, a ravaging war is deepening one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. while civilians are subject to gross human rights violations. In Iran, we have witnessed brutal crackdowns of protests demanding political change, democracy, and more freedom. Thousands have been killed, and many more stay arbitrarily detained and in the risk of a death penalty. In Afghanistan, the de facto authorities continue their inhuman treatment of women and girls, depriving them of their basic rights. Yet the Human Rights Council never lost its readiness to respond through monitoring, fostering dialogue, or establishing accountability mechanisms. Mr. President, children continue to bear a significant burden of conflict and poverty. Millions are denied to basic rights to education and health. Therefore, Croatia will continue to advocate for the respect of their rights on all matters affecting their lives. The widespread backlash in protection of women and girls is increasingly worrying. We continue our efforts to achieving gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. Croatia continues to oppose the death penalty in all circumstances. Working internationally with our partners towards its abolishment remains our standing priority. Mr. President, Croatia's experience as a victim of aggression of the 1990s has shaped our strong humanitarian engagement. The search for missing persons remains a national priority. We are still searching for 1,740 persons who went missing during their aggression against our country. We remain committed to clarifying their fate and call for access to archives that could provide essential information. Our humanitarian approach is reflected in our role as co-chair of the Global Alliance for the Missing and our active engagement in all relevant international fora. Assistance in clearing landmines is another cornerstone of Croatia's humanitarian effort. We have initiated, together with cross-regional partners, the Council's resolution on the impact of anti-personnel mines on the full enjoyment of human rights. In the United Nations General Assembly, we led the initiative to proclaim 26th June as the International Day of Deaf-Blindness with the aim of raising awareness of the rights of people with disabilities. Mr. President, Croatia's commitment to the United Nations human rights system is reflected in our engagement with the Universal Periodic Review. During our review in November 2025, we accepted the majority of recommendations received and are actively working on their implementation. Croatia continues the practice of voluntary contribution to OHCR with increased amount in 2025. Finally, we remain firmly committed to the universality of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Human Rights Council must preserve its pivotal role as their global guardian. Happy 20th anniversary. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Mohammed Dirif Ali, Minister of Justice of the Sudan. Excellency, you have the floor.
President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. On behalf of the government of Sudan and its people, we address you today as the terrorist militia rebellion in Sudan has completed its third year in one of the worst proxy war in the world, a war that targeted the very existence of Sudan and its people, a people which is now a target of this barbaric militia. One, its attempt to take over power by armies in April 2025, the militia continued its methodic targeting of basic infrastructure and strategic facilities and all public services. The aim is to displace civilians against whom it has committed atrocities beyond our capacity to describe them. The violations and crimes of militia are going unabated. Yesterday, it's invaded Mustariha region in northern Darfur. It targeted civilians, killed them, it looted, it scorched villages and cities. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we recall that the war has outstayed its welcome, and it should not have gone for this long had the international community, and particularly the UN and its bodies, including this August Assembly, had all this conducted their responsibility in rightly characterizing this military rebellion. And had they called a spade and countered Abu Dhabi government, which sponsored this terrorist militia and provided with high-tech army and provided with mercenaries, the misleading characterization of this war has given a green light for the militia to keep its flagrant violations. President, distinguished guests, at a time we see that the military of Sudan is conducting its constitutional responsibility by standing up to the militia, protecting the civilians and preserving the unity of the country and the rule of law, while staying committed to the international humanitarian law and the rules governing military engagement, and taking into account proportionality principles in order to protect civilians. In light of this, our government has stayed open to genuine efforts which aim to end the war and the rebellion on the basis of a roadmap that His Excellency, the President of the Transition Sovereignty Council provided, and the peace initiative provided by the Prime Minister to the Security Council on 22nd December 2025. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, as I address this august assembly, I should stress my government's commitment to continue cooperation and coordination with the human rights mechanisms in Sudan, i.e. the OHCHR country review and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Situation in Sudan. We underscore nationally that achieving justice and redress to victims and ensuring impunity is a top priority for us. We have made progress in this light by investigating into violations of national law and IHL. We underscore our commitment to continue facilitating and expediting delivery of humanitarian assistance to those affected by the war, including those under the control of the rebellious militia. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, in closing, I wish to thank the High Commissioner for his interest in visiting Sudan and meeting survivors of militias massacres in Al-Fashir and other regions. We are committed to coordination and cooperation with him and the country team in the country, and thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olusegun Ajadi Bakari, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Benin, via video message.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, President of the Human Rights Council, High Commissioner, Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is with a feeling of responsibility that I speak to you this August Council Assembly, which is the multilateral forum which is unique in its role that it plays in universally promoting human rights. In this, on this opportunity, I would like to express my heartfelt congratulations to the permanent representative of Indonesia for their outstanding election to chair the 20th session of the Council. This session, it coincides with the 20th anniversary of this institution, which gives us a historic opportunity to renew momentum to our collective commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights. My country, Benin, is honoured to be a member of the Council at this crucial moment for its future. In this context, Benin, since it was elected, is committed to any initiatives designed to promote a balanced and inclusive approach to human rights founded on the principles of indivisibility, interdependence, and universality of rights. This commitment is part of the dynamic transformation, structural transformation, which started in 2016 in Benin under the leadership of President Patrice Talon to consolidate the rule of law and to sustainably improve the living conditions for Benin populations. In 2023, my country submitted to the Council, when it was underwent its fourth UPR cycle, conclusive results, the outcome of sustained economic growth and mass investments, thanks to which we've significantly improved access of the public to education, to health, to drinking water, to electricity, and to basic social services, as well as to food and nutritional security throughout the national territory. Between 2023 and 2025, Benin also submitted to several UN treaty bodies its progress made in promoting and protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, women, children, and migrant workers. Our ambition is to strengthen constantly the rule of law and social justice in the country. That is what is behind the three Benin voluntary commitments under the Human Rights 75 scheme. Nevertheless, we have some challenges, namely, chiefly the terrorist threat, which is a major challenge to the stability and development of states. Benin remains resolutely determined to protect and to defend through all legitimate means its territorial integrity, as well as economic and social achievements, which have been hard won since 2016. This determination has made it possible for us to combat and ensure the failure of the destabilize our country on the 7th of December 2025, thanks to the loyalty of the Republican Defense and Security Forces, and thanks to effective security cooperation in the context of ECOWAS. It's the time and place today to underscore before this Council that these events, whilst painful in nature, were generated by the Benin authorities with restraint and strictly adhering to the rule of law without any measures of exception or emergency or any restriction to public freedoms, which is why Benin would like to express its thanks to the United Nations and to all of its partners, because they expeditiously condemned unreservedly this attempt to challenge the constitutional order. Benin remains convinced that democracy, the rule of law, and good governance are fundamental pillars of effective protection for and full enjoyment of human rights in all circumstances. Benin is faithful to its heritage and its values, which is why Benin will remain committed to the promotion and protection of human rights of persons of African descent. In the spirit of its law of the 2nd of September 2024 on the recognition of Benin nationality to Afro-descendants. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, Benin intends to pursue during the rest of its mandate its constructive engagement within the Council to ensure that the promotion and protection of human rights effectively serve the comprehensive development of the human persons, far from any political instrumentalization. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Alexandra Hill Tinoco, Minister of Foreign Affairs of El Salvador, via video message.
Mr. President, El Salvador appears before this Council today with respect, but also with the calm assurance that anybody who's taken difficult decisions on behalf of its people. I congratulate Mr. Sidharto Reza on his election and wish him every success, wisdom in leading this body under the principles of universality, objectivity, and, above all, coherence. Because to speak of human rights requires coherence, consistency. For years in my country, human rights were invoked in speeches, whilst at the same time thousands of Salvadorans lived as hostages of violence. People would speak of freedom, but there was no freedom to walk down a street in dignity. The right to life was reduced to a daily statistic. Since June 2019, under the leadership of President Nayib Bukele, El Salvador decided to change that reality by guaranteeing life and integrity to every person. That became the state's highest priority. Our security transformation was structural in nature. Streets were reclaimed, neighborhoods were freed from criminal control, and they are now spaces for community life and opportunities. To restore peace, to recover peace, was not an end, but just the beginning, because security without development is fragile, and development without security is an illusion. Therefore, we are making progress towards a comprehensive human rights vision. In health, we've incorporated technology to close historic gaps and guarantee equitable access. In early childhood, we protect breastfeeding as a right by strengthening healthcare policies, and this from the very first days of the life of a human being. In education and employment, we are promoting the modernization of schools and salary improvements because we are convinced that social justice and economic prosperity reinforce each other. El Salvador was a pioneer in adopting a global compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. We are convinced that true protection of human rights means creating conditions first so that no one is forced to migrate because of fear or because of lack of opportunity. Today, we work to ensure that migration is an option, not an obligation. We believe in cooperation. We believe in constructive dialogue. We also believe that every state has the right and the responsibility to protect its population according to its context, and this whilst respecting its constitutional framework and sovereignty. Human rights are not abstract concepts. They are lived in the safety of the streets. They are lived in stable employment. They are enjoyed in the health and education of children. El Salvador reaffirms today before its forum that it will always remain open to dialogue and firm in its conviction to preserve the state, the effective protection of its people. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mamadou Kassogu, Minister of Justice and Human Rights and Keeper of the Seals of Mali. You have the floor, Excellency.
Merci beaucoup.
I thank you very much. Excellencies, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. From the outset, Mr. President, may I convey to you our heartfelt congratulations for having been elected to preside over the Human Rights Council. And to ensure you of the support of my delegation, may I also, in this context, global context, which is uncertain, whose hallmark is the weakening of multilateralism, to restate the firm attachment of Mali and its people to the international law and to the principles and values of the UN Charter. Turning to the situation, the human rights situation in Mali, we've made significant progress, and we're delighted to report that in the area of security, the activities of the terrorist and criminal groups remain the main factors for human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, with a new modus operandi, namely economic terrorism, as a result of which we can no longer supply our towns and factories with oil, and because of this, there have been major problems. In the Sahel, the situation is complicated. The heads of state of the Confederation have pooled their efforts in this through the AIS Unified Force to stem terrorism, improving the overall security situation in Sahel with the support of certain strategic partners, and by strengthening what we do to put an end to human rights violations. It's the time and place for me to pay tribute to the memory of all the victims who have died in these on this battlefield in Mali. In the area of peace, national peace and reconciliation, Mali in August 2025 adopted the National Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation, designed to guarantee peace and social stability, cohesion and consolidating the culture of peace. More than a social contract, the Charter will be what guides what the authorities do to implement the reconciliation mechanisms and guaranteeing the legitimate rights of victims. Mr. President, as regards the political and institutional reforms, the government of Mali is continuing what it does to develop a text to implement the 2023 constitution, the reform of governance through the digitization of the administration and strengthening the authority of the state. The government is continuing what it has been doing to reform its structure, echoing the wish of the public through a Mali Vision 2060, wished by the people, and a Sustainable Development 2023-2024, whose ambition is to make Mali a country which is reconciled, stable and just and prosperous. The legal and judicial reforms are also underway, thanks to which we can better combat impunity in its all forms and guarantee greater promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Mr. President, the global context is increasingly fragile. Mali draws people's attention to certain facts with gravity which amount to serious threats to international peace and security and to the future of human rights. Namely, in particular, the flagrant violation of international law by some states, the fact that the violation of the rights of certain peoples, their violations being commonplace, and the indifference of the international community. Furthermore, Mali denounces strongly the support provided to terrorists and the many campaigns of demonization of the many states of the Sahel and misinformation led by a number of powers and their speeches in international bodies without any compassion for the victims of terrorism. Whilst vigorously condemning these often criminal, hostile, interventionistic actions, we recall that our choice to defend our integrity and national choices is irreversible, and the determination to respect the rights of the wishes of our people will remain. Mr. President, Mali reiterates its commitment to fundamental freedoms and renews its commitment to cooperate with all relevant mechanisms to promote and protect human rights by the United Nations, strict adherence to its sovereignty, dignity and its national interests. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Which one?
I think we're calling Sweden.
Thank you, Excellency. Sweden is here. I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Maria Malmer Stenergard, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, via video message.
President, it has been a challenging year, a year of unpredictability and conflict, a year in which too many people have woken up each day without the safety and the respect for human rights that they deserve. A year that has reminded us that we must never take international law for granted, that we must defend what we believe in. This Council must meet these challenges through unity and action. Like good health, human rights are not top of mind when all is well. It is only when our human rights are threatened that we see their full significance. When Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine enters its 5th year and its ruthless attacks continue to leave civilians without heating in freezing conditions, when tens of thousands of Ukrainian children have been forcibly transferred and deported, when multiple reports conclude that systematic torture, rape and summary executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees have been committed, when political prisoners in Belarus suffer inhumane conditions, when the humanitarian suffering in Gaza continues and we witness unprecedented levels of settlement expansion and violence in the West Bank. When people demonstrating for improved living conditions and for human rights are met with deadly violence in Iran. When civilians in Sudan are displaced time over time. In such times, we are reminded of the importance of human rights. Sweden will continue to be principled in our defense of a rules-based order that puts the freedom, dignity, and equal rights of every individual at its core. We will always support the international human rights system and the architecture of accountability. In this spirit, we welcome the UN80 initiative. We need to build a UN that is equipped to meet the challenges of today and of coming decades. The UN human rights pillar must be strengthened. The treaty bodies, the special procedures, and investigative mechanisms. The Office of the High Commissioner all must be given the means and the independence they need to fulfill their vital mandates. With this comes high expectations. It requires integrity, professionalism, and clear objectivity from everyone who represents it. A strong UN is built through dedication, collaboration, and a commitment to continuous improvement. High standards, accountability, and principled neutrality are not just expectations, they are the foundations that enable us to deliver impactful and positive results together. Civil society must have safe and meaningful access. Human rights defenders, independent media, they are the windows of this council. They let the light in. President, multilateralism, like democracy, is hard work. It can be slow, it can be frustrating, but when it succeeds, it builds strength. And it builds predictability for states and individuals alike. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Chris Elmore, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Multilateral Human Rights, Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, when the United Kingdom asked the world to place its trust in us and return to this Council, we made a clear promise that we would use our seat to defend human dignity wherever it is threatened. Today, standing here as a member once again, I want to renew that promise plainly, openly and with conviction. Because at its heart, this Council is about people, their lives, their freedoms, their safety. And in too many places, those basic rights are being torn away. 4 years has passed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 4 years in which ordinary people have endured airstrikes, unlawful detentions, torture, executions. Last year alone, nearly 15,000 civilians were killed as Russia intensified its attacks. We are also seeing immense suffering in Gaza, with families living through a humanitarian crisis that deepens day by day. That is why aid must get in and why civilians must be protected. And to turn that urgency into lasting change, including in the West Bank, the 20-point plan must now move swiftly to its next phase, so we can begin building the foundations for a two-state solution. In Iran, thousands of families continue to grieve for loved ones killed during protests. Others search for answers about relatives who remain in prison or have simply disappeared. When this Council came together in special session last month, it showed what the UN can achieve when we act with urgency and purpose. And that is something we must strengthen as we look ahead to the UN 80 agenda. The human rights system we shape for the next generation must be one that adds value where no one else can, and one that delivers impact where the need is greatest. It must be able to investigate the worst abuses, to hold perpetrators to account, and to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Nowhere is that more urgently needed than in Sudan and South Sudan. In Sudan, millions have been displaced, civilians have been targeted, communities have been shattered. The fact-finding mission on Sudan remains key to ensuring the truth is documented. The findings of its report on al-Fasher last week were truly horrific. Atrocities including systematic starvation, torture, killings, rape and deliberate ethnic targeting used on the most horrendous scale. As the Foreign Secretary said in her statement at the UN Security Council on Thursday, these crimes must not go unanswered. There must be accountability. In South Sudan, too many communities are trapped between escalating clashes, sexual violence, forced recruitment and crushing of political freedoms. Actions that undermine the revitalised agreement and distort governance structures are worsening the crisis. The Commission on Human Rights is indispensable, exposing abuses, preserving evidence and pressing for accountability, so South Sudan's people are neither forgotten nor abandoned to impunity. But alongside these crises, there are moments of hope. In Syria, we have seen commitments from the Syrian government that offer the possibility of a more inclusive future. Those steps must continue, and they must lead to a transition that reflects the aspirations of all Syrians. And throughout all these struggles, across conflict zones, courtrooms, remote villages and crowded cities, one group stands at the front line: human rights defenders. These ordinary people doing extraordinary things offer at great personal risk. The world is becoming more dangerous for them, and we cannot allow that to continue. That is why the United Kingdom is committing £2.5 million to the Lighthouse Fund to support and protect those brave individuals. Mr. Vice President, we return to this Council humbled by the responsibility and energised by the work ahead. We will listen, we will act, and we will stand with everyone who believes, as we do, that human rights are universal and defending them is the surest way to build a safer, fairer world. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency.
We'll have to go to Ukraine for video message.
Yeah. Okay. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Andrei Sybiha, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, via video message.
Mr. President, I congratulate you on assuming the Council presidency. I wish you every success in guiding its work in these challenging times. Excellencies, friends, it is my honor to address you today. Yesterday we marked a painful anniversary. 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But today we must look to the future, and it is up to us to define it. How we treat abuses today will define the world we live in tomorrow. Human rights have never been secondary in this war. They are at the core of it. Systemic abuse is how Russia wages war. Ukraine is not only a battlefield. Ukraine is a place of crime, a crime scene. Turning a blind eye to this means making impunity a role model. This is not normality, and we must not tolerate it. As long as Russia continues its brutal violations, the ground must be burning under the feet of those responsible. Today, I have 3 simple messages. First, there can be no normality while crimes continue. Despite peace efforts and calls for de-escalation, Russia escalates. Ukraine takes constructive steps. Russia responds with missiles and drones. Russia continues to torture Ukrainians in captivity, prisoners of war and civilian hostages. These are not isolated incidents. This is a documented pattern. It happens on a massive scale, and there is one crime that should never be managed or explained away: Russia's abduction of Ukrainian children. Thousands have been forcibly transferred, separated from their families, and stripped of their identity. This is a robbery of childhood. Ukraine and partners have managed to bring back more than 2,000 children, and we welcome the return of our prisoners of war and civilians as a result of the US-led peace process. But too many remain in captivity. Every day of delay means more torture, more stolen lives, more stolen childhood. And I urge states to use your influence to secure releases and returns, to support UN monitoring and documentation, and to ensure real accountability. Second, the problem is not a lack of norms. It is a lack of enforcement. This year marks 60 years since the adoption of 2 fundamental international instruments on civil and political rights and on economic, social and cultural rights. These texts are strong, but they are only as strong as our willingness to enforce them. Russia violates these obligations every day. This means millions of people are robbed of normal life. Monitoring matters, documentation matters, but documentation alone does not stop crimes. Only accountability does. Only justice served and law enforced can protect human rights in practice. There must be consequences, real, personal, and unavoidable for those who order and commit these crimes. Third, Ukraine is looking to the future, and we ask the Council to do the same with a global view. Ukraine holds the line of freedom. Our people are defending not only our country, but the human dignity as a principle. That is why Ukraine has presented its candidacy for membership in years 27 to 29. For us, this is not about a seat. It is about responsibility to strengthen this Council's ability to respond to systematic abuse, to prevent repetition, and to ensure that impunity does not become a model. And this must be our approach everywhere, from Ukraine to Sudan and to every place where civilians are brutalized. There can be no tolerance for human rights violations, no acceptance of the unacceptable. Mr. President, human rights have never been secondary in this war against my country. It is our common task to ensure that human rights never become secondary on the world's agenda. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Josip Brkic, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address the Human Rights Council on behalf of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Nearly 8 decades ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out a moral and legal compass for humanity, reminding that lasting peace, justice, and development are possible only when individual and collective human rights are protected everywhere without discrimination. In our last Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights adopted during the 59th session of the Human Rights Council, it reflected tangible progress in human rights. Bosnia and Herzegovina has strengthened its anti-discriminatory framework. We have aligned our national institutions with the Paris Principle, and we deepened our commitment to gender equality. A new gender action plan has been adopted, and the progress has been achieved in the protection of vulnerable groups, as well as in the freedom of expression and media safety. However, having made substantial progress, we acknowledge that some challenging remains. Allow me to address the issue of challenging and respect human rights through the example of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society. Bosnia and Herzegovina is both demographically and constitutionally formed by 3 constituent peoples who also embody 3 major world religions: Bosniaks who are predominantly Muslims, Serbs who are predominantly Orthodox Christians, and the Croats who are predominantly Catholic Christians. According to the last census in Bosnia and Herzegovina 2013, more than 97% of the population participate in one of those 3 constituent people. In the same foundational principle was reaffirming at the end of the war in the 90s, during which armies of all 3 constituent people were engaged. The constitutional status of 3 peoples were explicitly confirmed 30 years ago in the Dayton Peace Agreement in the preamble of Annex 4, which is the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our country was thus established as a 2-dimensional federation. In one dimension, it's territorial federation composed of 2 entities and District of Brčko. In the second dimension, it is an institutional federation of 3 constituent peoples reflected in its constitutional architecture, a bicameral parliamentary assembly, House of Representatives and the House of People, in which each constituent people are equally represented alongside with the tripartite presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, composed of 1 representative from each constituent people. However, serious challenges emerged following interventions by successive high representatives of the international community in the constitutional and the electoral framework of my country. These changes enabled majority of 1 constituent people in the entity of Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina to elect the position constitutionally reserved for Croats in the presidency and House of People, representatives who do not enjoy the genuine democratic support of the Croat electorate. As a result, the Croat people have been without a legitimately elected member of the presidency for 16 years, and in 2 electoral cycles have lacked legitimate representation at the executive level. Despite a binding ruling of the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in which instructed the Parliamentary Assembly to amend the election law to ensure legitimate representation of each constituent people where constitutionally required, this decision has remained unimplemented for nearly a decade. Also, decisions of the European Court of Human Rights in the cases Sejdic-Finci and similar are pending to be implemented in Bosnia and Herzegovina. At this point in particular, in the cases Kovacevic against Bosnia and Herzegovina or Begic against Bosnia and Herzegovina, I underline the position of the European Court of Human Rights that actio popularis, applications by politicians with the aim to change constitutional architecture and to abolish the overreaching principle of the BNH constitutional people principle, are not welcomed. The consequences of this prolonged denial of collective rights are tangible. Due to political uncertainty and systematic marginalization, the Croat population in Bosnia and Herzegovina has been steadily declining from approximately 800,000 before the war until the last estimations about 350,000 people. The never-ending presence of the Office of the High Representative may unintentionally affect the space for the inclusive internal dialogue and consensus building among 3 constituent peoples whose shared responsibility is to shape the future of our country. Excellencies, this case illustrates a fundamental truth that the denial and disrespect of the collective rights in multinational societies directly erodes and violates individual human rights. Respect for constitutional arrangements, the rule of law, and democratic legitimacy is not a zero-sum game. It is a prerequisite for equality, stability, and lasting peace. We therefore call upon all those committed to democracy and human rights to support Bosnia and Herzegovina in fulfilling its constitutional and international obligations in full accordance with the principles upon which this Council is founded. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Marie Chatardova, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished delegates. We meet at a time when the international legal order, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are under severe strain from ongoing aggression and repression. Our compass is clear: full respect for the UN Charter and international law, protection of human rights and freedoms, and accountability as the path to peace and justice. At the same time, we must acknowledge that the credibility of our commitments depends on our ability to translate them into realistic, sustainable action, grounded in the capacities of states and institutions. For the Czech Republic, Ukraine remains high on the agenda. 4 years after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, we reaffirm that Ukrainians' sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity should be respected. We have been providing robust political, humanitarian, and practical support to Ukraine since 2022 and continue to cooperate closely with partners. We support a diplomatic path to end the war in line with the principles of the UN Charter, alongside continued humanitarian assistance. International justice has also spoken. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for the unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children from occupied territories, and alleged war crimes under the Rome Statute. Accountability remains essential. However, its pursuit must go hand in hand with practical efforts to prevent further suffering and to create conditions for a durable peace. We continue to monitor the human rights situation in Belarus. Working with our partners and this Council, we will respond to the UN-documented crackdown on fundamental rights and freedoms, including freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association, politically motivated prosecutions, and ill treatment of detainees. We urge to continue releasing all political prisoners and call on Belarus to comply with its international obligations. Democracy and the rule of law rely on independent judiciaries, free and fair elections, free media, effective anti-corruption frameworks. This Council remains a vital forum to defend civic space while upholding the universality and interdependence of human rights. Last, high-level debates and interventions have reaffirmed the Council's central role. The Czech Republic supports the responsibility of the Human Rights Council to focus on country situations where grave violations persist and on accountability for serious international crimes. We equally support the Council's thematic work that strengthens rights protection, including equal participation in public and political affairs, rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, human rights of older persons, persons with disabilities, or protection of individuals and vulnerable groups in the digital space. We also recognize that the ultimate purpose of our norms is to protect people. A realistic, context-sensitive approach, faithful to principles, yet attentive to consequences, can make our action more human and more effective. I cannot but mention the role and responsibility of the UN mandate holders. In this context, some statements of the Special Rapporteur on the OPT unfortunately do not help. This year's UN 80 moment is an opportunity to reinvigorate multilateralism and make the UN fitter for purpose. We support the UN 80 initiative in its ambition to streamline mandates, improve efficiency and impact, and align the system with today's needs, while upholding human rights and the rule of law. The stakes are high. Aggression, repression, and impunity should never be normalized. The Czech Republic will continue working with all partners in this Council to protect fundamental rights and freedoms, support accountability and reparations for victims, and help secure peace in Ukraine, for the security of Europe and beyond, and the credibility of the international rules-based order. Our objective is a human rights policy that is principled, realistic, and capable of delivering concrete results for those who need it most. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Monsignor Daniel Pacho, Undersecretary for the Multilateral Sector of the Section for Relations with States and International Organizations of the Holy See. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, 20 years have passed from the establishment of this Human Rights Council. Since then, the world has changed radically and multilateralism weakened. A diplomacy that promotes dialogue and seeks consensus among all parties is being replaced by a diplomacy based on force by either individuals or groups of allies. Yet amidst this shifting landscape, human rights remain the cornerstone of any flourishing society, offering hope and rejecting contempt for the other, brutality and injustice. However, the Human Rights Project is currently facing a credibility crisis. The retreat from multilateral frameworks by some states is particularly troubling, as is the erosion of meaning across the multilateral system. Trust is eroded when the foundational principles of the system, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Human Rights Conventions and treaties, are no longer considered as a shared language and a common agenda, but are rather undergoing reinterpretation or selective endorsement. This shift has the potential to have far-reaching consequences, including the breakdown of dialogue and trust, as well as the misallocation of valuable energy and resources that could be used to address the fundamental causes of global suffering. This issue is further compounded by the ongoing proliferation of so-called new rights. It is evident that a paradox is being observed, wherein fundamental rights are being restricted under the guise of these so-called new rights. Indeed, as Pope Leo XIV affirms, in the current context, we are seeing an actual short circuit of human rights. The right to freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, religious freedom, and even the right to life are being restricted in the name of other so-called new rights, with the result that the very framework of human rights is losing its vitality and creating space for force and oppression. This occurs when each right becomes self-referential, and especially when it becomes disconnected from reality, nature, and truth. End of quotation. Mr. Vice President, the protection of the right to life constitutes the indispensable foundation of every other human right. This commitment is founded upon the defense of the inalienable dignity of every individual from the moment of conception to natural death. This commitment is evident in the protection of the family, the most fundamental building block of society, where human life is nurtured and developed. It is of paramount importance to counteract the worrying tendency within the international system to neglect and marginalize the institution of the family, mindful that as the family goes, so too goes the whole world. It is also essential to fully guarantee the right to freedom of religion or belief, the first of human rights, which expresses the most fundamental reality of the human person. One of the most prevalent crises in today's world is the ongoing persecution of Christians, affecting over 380 million believers. This unfortunate situation has deteriorated further in 2025 due to the exacerbating factors of conflict and extremism. Moreover, it is crucial to address the phenomenon of polite persecution that is spreading in Western societies, where believers are increasingly restricted in living and proclaiming the gospel, particularly when it comes to defending life from conception to its natural end, the family, or migrants, under the guise of tolerance. Mr. Vice President, in order to protect the progress of the past 8 decades, which has been painstakingly achieved since the establishment of the United Nations, it is necessary to return to the only path with the potential to generate peace, a dialogue firmly grounded in the inalienable God-given dignity of the human person. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Excellency. I have the honor to give the floor now to Her Excellency Ms. Theodora Constantinidou, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cyprus. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address the 61st high-level segment of the Human Rights Council. Over the past 2 decades, the Council has significantly advanced human rights globally and nationally, shaped norms in response to emerging global challenges, and strengthened accountability. The Council has responded to human rights emergencies and maintained attention on multiple country situations, thematic priorities, prevention efforts, and the streamlining of human rights across the UN system, despite chronic underfunding and today's financial and liquidity crisis. Recognition of achievements and progress is essential, yet it cannot obscure the reality that the global human rights landscape is under severe strain. Armed conflicts continue to erode the protection of the most basic human rights, underscoring that our collective work is far from complete. As we mark 4 years since Russia's illegal act of war against Ukraine, we reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. In Gaza, the humanitarian situation demands urgent, effective action in full accordance with international law. Regarding Syria, the full implementation of the agreement reached is essential to unity, safeguarding the rights of all without distinction, and promoting accountability as a cornerstone of sustainable peace and cooperation. Sudan faces the world's largest humanitarian and displacement crisis, with confirmed famine conditions and grave violations of human rights. We also reaffirm our support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and call for immediate escalation, protection of civilians, and unhindered humanitarian access. In Iran, we remain deeply concerned about the troubling human rights situation. Excellencies, in an increasingly complex and polarized geopolitical environment, we have gathered in Geneva to reaffirm our unwavering commitment to multilateralism, not as an abstraction, but as a necessity. No progress in human rights can be achieved nor sustained without genuine multilateral cooperation grounded in the UN Charter. These principles must guide our collective work, including efforts under the UN8 initiative to strengthen the United Nations' effectiveness and credibility. Commonly agreed rules and effective multilateral institutions with the UN at their core are the best means to assure peace, security, human rights, and sustainable development for all. A strong and credible multilateral system demands a strong and credible human rights pillar with adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding in line with the Pact for the Future. In this regard, efforts towards the streamlining of the Human Rights Council must aim at strengthening implementation, improving follow-up, and avoiding duplication between Geneva and New York. As a current member of the Council, Cyprus is proud to have been contributing actively, advancing key priorities such as gender equality, preventing femicide, promoting the rights of persons with disabilities, and supporting cultural rights. As also Cyprus currently holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, we are contributing to a coordinated EU engagement across multilateralism and the human rights agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be remiss if I did not refer to the ongoing violations of the human rights in my own country. The ongoing occupation of part of Cyprus following Turkey's invasion will mark 52 years in 2026. For decades, Cypriots have endured a displacement, the unresolved fate of missing persons, and restrictions on fundamental rights. The government of the Republic of Cyprus remains firmly committed to the reunification of Cyprus and its people through the resumption of meaningful negotiations aimed at achieving a just and lasting settlement in line with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We will spare no effort to end human rights violations in Cyprus and everywhere for everyone. As we mark 20 years of the Human Rights Council, this anniversary warrants a deep reflection. Challenging times such as these demand steadiness and commitment. For Cyprus, the resilience of international norms is inseparable from our own historical experience. So a rules-based order is far from a theoretical preference. It is the essential condition under which states, big or small, and their citizens can rely on law and human rights rather than power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Francisco Caraballo Nunes, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs for Bilateral Foreign Policy of the Dominican Republic. Excellency, you have the floor.
Buenos días.
Good morning, Madam Vice President, Deputy High Commissioner of the OHHR, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues. The Dominican Republic is a founding member of the United Nations and was one of the countries which actively participated in the creation of this Human Rights Council. And as such, we maintain our firm conviction that multilateralism remains the most legitimate and effective mechanism we have to tackle the challenges that are affecting our societies and the global community, always mainstreaming human dignity throughout and at all times. As a number of speakers who took before me have said, today the international scene is one in which crises converge, which test the credibility of the multilateral system itself. Added to this, we have a growing form of revisionism that distorts values and principles which have sustained post-war order, in particular those values and principles that guarantee the rule of law, equality before the law, and the universality of human rights. For a small island developing state such as ours, human rights are a fundamental condition if we want to have resilience, social cohesion, and stability. This conviction is what guides what we do nationally and internationally. 3 years ago, we became a member of this Human Rights Council. At the time, we were convinced that the size of a state does not limit the scale of its commitment. We have strived to honour the trust invested in us. We have advocated in favour of a Human Rights Council that is more inclusive by promoting support to hybrid modalities, thanks to which smaller states, civil society and vulnerable communities can have a voice, given that participation is the legitimate essence, is the essence of multilateral legitimacy. Together with a group of states which are committed thereto, we were the lead sponsor of the historic resolution on the sea level rise and its effect on full enjoyment of human rights. That is a clear acknowledgement that climate change is not only an environmental issue, but it is also a human rights issue, and in many cases it is a case of survival. We also have worked actively on drafting an optional protocol on free education, ranging from pre-primary to secondary education, because we are convinced that without education there cannot be real equality, there can be no development, and there can be no lasting peace. We also promoted the resolution on the economic empowerment of women, and we did so because we believe that in a society, only a society that has greater equality can get rid of structural, cultural and institutional barriers which prevent women from occupying their rightful place in society. What we have done has always been geared towards strengthening social protection, towards extending inclusive policies to include people with disabilities, and to promote support to providing economic support directly for the elderly who are without income, because nobody should become old and remain vulnerable and be neglected. We are proud of the work we do with the UPR and with the treaty bodies and with special procedures. We stand by that work. We submit our reports, we receive and accept recommendations, we engage in dialogue with openness, because we believe in a system that doesn't shy away from scrutiny, but rather embraces scrutiny as a tool for improvement. Excellencies, the credibility and authority of this Council is not measured solely by how firm it is before high-level geopolitical conflicts. It's also measured by how consistently and successfully it attends to crises that affect all regions independently of the size of the region. Multilateralism cannot be selective. It must apply the same standard to all situations, which is why we believe that the human rights situations of the people of Haiti should be a priority, and the international community should drive forward effective cooperation that gives priority to the protection of the civilian population there and the strengthening of the institutions in Haiti. The Caribbean cannot be a footnote on the international agenda. Finally, as we get close to the end of our membership of this Council, the Dominican Republic is not appearing before you to bid farewell, but rather to restate its commitment, its determination to continue to build with you. Our aspiration is to recover trust of member states so that we can continue to defend a council that is more inclusive, more accessible, and to work together with you on the necessary reforms, thanks to which we will be able to have a body which is increasingly effective and efficient in how it fulfills its mandate. Our candidacy for re-election for the next session is a proposal to continue to be committed, not with promises, but with a time-proven commitment to the Council's success. As this SG said at the beginning of this session, and I quote, "A world that protects human rights is, in essence, a world that protects itself," end of quote. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Leo Ryan Pinder, the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs of the Bahamas, by video message.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Excellencies, and distinguished delegates. For those of us who come from island nations, the language of the sea is fundamental to how we understand the world. We know that it is to navigate uncertain waters. We know the discipline required when winds rise and landmarks disappear. And we know the value of fixed points that keep a vessel on course. Human rights are a shared moral compass, with multilateralism and respect for international law as our North Star. As we navigate today's unsettled geopolitical waters, marked by conflict and declining trust, Human rights are beacons that illuminate danger, warn against excess, and guide us towards the harbors of dignity, justice, and peace. For small states like the Bahamas, recommitting to a rules-based order is not only our preference, it is our protection. International law is the great equalizer, the assurance that every vessel, large and small, can set sail with its rights and sovereignty respected. Nowhere is this clearer than in the climate crisis. For the Bahamas and fellow small island developing states, climate change is already transforming where and how our people live, threatening our livelihoods, food security, and the very land beneath our feet. Its human rights consequences demand urgent collective action. We therefore welcome the Council's work in this area, including the recent consensus resolution on sea level rise and human rights presented by a core group inclusive of the Bahamas. Its recognition of the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change, acknowledgement of the continuity of statehood, and support for regional capacity building are important steps. We must work harder to scale up ambition, finance, and solidarity. Those who contributed least must not bear the heavy burdens. Mr. President, for SIDS, fairness must also extend to global economic governance and our right to development. Unilateral and coercive blacklisting practices disproportionately target small island states, unjustly damage reputations, and restrict fiscal space, all while substituting power for principle. We therefore reaffirm the importance of advancing a United Nations framework convention on international tax cooperation that is transparent and grouped in equal participation. We are also mindful of challenges within our hemisphere. We remain committed to maintaining the Caribbean as a zone of peace and to dialogue and have cooperation. The situation in Haiti is profound concern. We welcome the forthcoming operationalization of the gang suppression force and will continue to support and facilitate efforts in this regard. We encourage sustained engagement by the Council and the High Commissioner, with emphasis on institutional strengthening, civilian protection, and a Haitian-led solution. As a nation whose history and identity are deeply connected to the African diaspora, the Bahamas attaches particular importance to advancing the rights of people of African descent. We welcome the proclamation of the Second International Decade and continue to call for the legacies of slavery and colonialism to be addressed through honesty, dialogue, and concrete measures towards justice and inclusion. Mr. President, capacity constraints are a daily reality for small states. Technical assistance is therefore indispensable. We highly value the OHCHR regional office base in Nassau serving CARICOM. It provides, and its presence proves that in times of austerity, partnership and proximity enhance impact. The office will continue to be adequately resourced to continue carrying out its critical work. We also commend the Voluntary Technical Assistance Trust Fund for LDCs and SIDS, which strengthens participation and implementation. As a core state of the Convention Against Torture Initiative, the Bahamas is committed to sharing experiences and supporting states on their ratification and implementation journeys. Nationally, the establishment of the Parliamentary Human Rights Committee reinforces legislative oversight, supports compliance with international obligations, and embeds human rights more firmly in the governance of our great country. Mr. President, in turbulent times, the world looks to the United Nations for principled leadership, clarity, fairness, and consistency. It is in this spirit that the Bahamas has decided for the first time to seek election as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council for 2032 and 33 under the theme Resilience, Relationships, Representation. Our candidature reflects the conviction that SIDS voices must be heard and human rights, climate change, and security are inextricable. The waters before the international community are rough, but small island states know that panic is not a strategy and power alone does not guarantee safe passage. What carries us forward is discipline, cooperation, and adherence to the instruments that guide us. The Bahamas remains committed to working with all partners to ensure that this council stands as a lighthouse for the world, pointing us always towards the ports of justice, peace, and hope. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Abdul Khalik Shalik, Federal Secretary of the Ministry of Human Rights of Pakistan. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam Vice President, I congratulate you and members of the Bureau on your appointments for the Human Rights Council's landmark 20th cycle. As Pakistan starts its sixth term as Council member, we reaffirm our abiding support for its mandate and agenda. Our work to uphold human rights in Pakistan is guided by fundamental principles enshrined in our Constitution and obligations under international human rights law. As Secretary for Human Rights, I oversee Pakistan's national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and following up with UN treaty bodies. We engage with these expert mechanisms, guided by the duty to do progressively better for our nearly 240 million people. The UN Human Rights Treaty bodies and other mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review are important success stories of the Council. We are concerned that resource constraints are impacting their valuable work. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' inability to carry out mandates entrusted by this Council is also of concern. Yet our concerns go beyond budget. Madam Vice President, efforts to undermine the United Nations, the UN Charter, and this Council's mandate are all deeply worrying. Eroding the promise of international law has adverse implications for everyone, particularly those most vulnerable. In Afghanistan, millions of women and girls face almost total disenfranchisement. Even their most basic human rights are being denied. The Afghan Taliban is instrumentalizing negative cultural norms against women and trying to cover up its excesses by misinterpreting religion. Islam must not be invoked for the Afghan Taliban's unjustifiable suppression of women's rights. Madam Vice President, the right to self-determination is the root of the international human rights movement. Suppressing it has consequences that are avoidable, clear, and tragic. In illegally occupied Palestine, genocide is paving the way for settler colonial expansion with no end in sight. Personal attacks and false accusations against UN Special Rapporteur on the OPT only reward Israel's disregard for international law with further impunity. We affirm our unwavering support for the Palestinian people, their right to self-determination, and the realization of an independent, viable, and contiguous state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds and Al-Sharif as its capital. In Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, the Kashmiri people are being robbed of their inalienable rights promised by the UN Charter and reaffirmed by the UN Security Council. The suffering of the people of IIOJK being covered up by a media blackout and political restrictions and whitewashed with electoral gimmicks and empty promises of development. But self-determination is not for sale. We urge the High Commissioner's Office to resume its reporting on Jammu and Kashmir. We also invite this Council to reflect on the future of human rights movement if its roots and self-determination were allowed to wither. Madam Vice President, human rights are not a luxury to be enjoyed by a few or only when times are good. Instead, they should be cherished and protected amidst uncertainty, conflict, and complex global challenges. We must step up collective efforts to combat hatred and deep-seated inequalities within and among states, both of which compound human rights risks in a vicious cycle. Rising religious hate, particularly Islamophobia in political discourse, is of grave concern. Islamophobia is being used as an avenue for political advancement and popularity. Prejudice against Muslims is being stalked rather than countered, and incitement to hostility or discrimination is being legitimized. This year marks the 45th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief, the 40th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, and 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. In the past 2 decades, the Council has developed further normative complements to strengthen human rights. We therefore possess a powerful toolkit to respond to the serious human rights challenges facing us today. We must use it without delay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jukka Salovaara, Permanent State Secretary of Finland. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished participants, we are living in times of transition. The political climate is divisive and human rights are openly challenged. However, the universality of human rights constitutes the foundation of the international system, and when they erode in one place, security is weakened everywhere. Amid geopolitical competition and increasing conflicts, the United Nations provides the only universal forum where all states sit at the same table. It offers mechanisms for preventing conflicts and rules that protect us from a world governed by the law of the strongest. Human rights are an integral part of security policy and conflict prevention. Many crises stem from human rights violations, and societies that respect the human rights of all are more stable and prosperous. For the past 20 years, the Human Rights Council has had a vital role in promoting human rights for every person worldwide. Madam Vice President, in wars and conflicts, those among the first to suffer are women and girls, LGBTIQ+ persons, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and human rights defenders. In a time marked by disinformation and challenges to democracy, knowledge produced by independent institutions, and fact-based decision-making is critically important. The High Commissioner and his office, the UN special procedures and the treaty bodies are independent, and their integrity and ability to work must be safeguarded. Without reliable information, human rights cannot be protected. Media freedom faces ever-growing threats around the world. Journalists and media workers face physical violence and harassment. As co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, Finland focuses on protecting journalists and improving media literacy to tackle disinformation. Across the world, the operating space for civil society is shrinking. This Council provides international protection for human rights defenders, amplifies the voices of those who have been silenced, and reminds us, the member states, of our obligations. Without civil society, human rights cannot advance. The United Nations is confronting a severe financial crisis that threatens its ability to carry out core mandates. The UN80 reform and the Human Rights Council review offer key opportunities to strengthen effectiveness, but no reform can succeed without adequate and predictable resources. Securing sufficient funding for human rights is essential for global peace, security, stability, and sustainable development. Madam Vice President, Russia has continued a war of aggression against Ukraine already for over 4 years. Last year was the deadliest year for civilians in Ukraine. Because of Russia's war, civilians in Ukraine have suffered, in addition to loss of life, injuries, torture, rape, and deportation of their children to Russia. In addition to the suffering of millions of Ukrainian civilians, Russia has also engaged in ever-increasing internal repression, threatening the life and freedom of human rights defenders in Russia. We have followed with concern how the national security law in China has limited basic rights in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. We call on China to engage in genuine and open dialogue with the international community on the human rights situation in China, including Xinjiang and Tibet. Finland stands in solidarity with the Iranian people who have voiced their legitimate aspirations for a better life, freedom and dignity. We strongly condemn the brutal repression of peaceful protests across Iran. Finland expresses grave concern over increasing Israeli control in the occupied Palestinian territory and calls on all sides to protect civilians and lift all restrictions on humanitarian aid. Finland is also deeply concerned over the human rights situation in Sudan, Afghanistan and Belarus. Finland recommends that the United States to resume cooperation with the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism. We are deeply concerned about the imposition of sanctions against the International Criminal Court. Madam Vice President, this is a moment to reflect on the kind of future and world we wish to build. Do we choose a society that values every person, respects human rights, and enables people to live well, or one marked by uncertainty, fear, and the erosion of rules? The Human Rights Council, with its valuable mechanisms, shows us where we stand and where we are heading. The office's work around the world provides early warnings so that dangerous developments can still be halted. Finland shares the High Commissioner's vision on the Global Alliance for Human Rights to ensure that human rights remain our collective compass. Together we decide what kind of world we want to build. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Next, I have the honor to give the floor to Mr. Alexander De Croo, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme by video message.
Distinguished President of the Human Rights Council, Mr. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address this Council on behalf of the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. It comes at a moment when the promise of human rights is being tested across the world. Development has lifted millions from poverty and expanded opportunity. Yet conflict, inequality, climate disruption, and shrinking civic space are weakening the social contract. Billions lack meaningful social protection. Violence against women and girls continues at alarming levels. These are structural fractures in systems, in governance, and in trust. As a part of the United Nations family, UNDP is working with governments and other partners and is helping to address the root causes of instability before they solidify into more permanent fragility. Allow me to highlight three priorities. First, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a compass for all our work. We internalize human rights in our strategic plans. UNDP supports climate action in over 140 countries that protects the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We advance digital innovation that expands freedom and participation. In our engagement with the private sector, over 5,000 companies were supported in 2025 to improve human rights compliance in their operations and supply chains. Secondly, human rights defenders, independent media, civil society, and community justice leaders are the infrastructure of resilient societies. UNDP works with national institutions, including national human rights institutions and justice actors, to expand access to justice, protect civic space, and promote and protect human rights, particularly in fragile and crisis-affected contexts. This engagement by UNDP has led to the resolution of hundreds of human rights cases in Nigeria, support for the right to vote in Georgia, and the protection of detainees' rights in Malawi. Finally, UNDP engages with governments and rights holders to embed human rights in the architecture of governance itself. This matters because stability built on exclusion is fragility waiting to surface. Last year alone, UNDP directly supported 60 countries worldwide in integrating rights-based approaches into their unique development pathways. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, development powered by human rights is one of the strongest tools we have to advance peace, trust, and shared prosperity for all. Alongside the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and partners across the UN system, UNDP will continue to translate principles into life-changing results. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, this was the last speaker on my list for this meeting. We will reconvene this afternoon at 2:30 sharp to continue with the high-level segment and thereafter to hold the general segment. I hereby close the 6th meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council.